Hola, hola, hola. Bienvenidos to the Paseo podcast. I'm Joshua Smyser-DeLeon. We're going to be talking about the Young Lords from the organization's beginnings in Chicago to the impact they've had on the Boricua community, not only here in Chicago, but throughout the world. But before I introduce our guests for this episode, I want to acknowledge the fact that we are recording this interview on site in person here in Chicago, and I'm joined by members of our team. You can't see them on the camera for people watching on our YouTube channel, but we have Richie Riquena in the building, Vic Medina, and Joel Ortiz helping us doing some magic behind the camera lenses. So they're all hard at work with us today. I really love the chances to come out, record these interviews in person. It's always a lot of fun. So as I mentioned before, Young Lords is what we're talking about today. If you're hearing the Young Lords name for the first time, in short, the Young Lords, also known as the Young Lords Organization, was founded on September 23rd, 1968. It started as a Chicago-based street gang and evolved into a civil and human rights organization. The group aimed to fight for neighborhood empowerment and self-determination for Puerto Rico, Latinos, and colonized people. It was most active in the late 60s and 70s. So today, to help us take a deep dive into Young Lords history, I'm joined by two special guests. The first is José Cha Cha Jiménez, sitting across from me at the table. He is a political activist. And I'm also joined by Dr. Jacqueline Lazú, an associate professor in the Department of Modern Languages at DePaul University and associate dean of research and graduate studies in DePaul's College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. Her forthcoming book is titled Stone Revolutionaries, The Chicago Young Lords and the Origins of a Movement. She is recognized as a leading scholar on the Young Lords organization and has helped establish DePaul's Young Lords Special Collections Archive as a destination for the study of Puerto Rican Chicago, the Rainbow Coalition, the Illinois Black Panther Party, and 1960s and 1970s social justice movements. Cha Cha and Jackie, super happy to have you on the show. Welcome to the Paseo podcast. How are you doing today?
I've been working with Jackie, as you said, for many years. We've done, in terms of the Young Lords, a lot of documentation of the history. As people know, Lincoln Park was the home of the first Puerto Ricans, large Puerto Rican establishment in Chicago, and it was displaced completely. And so that's how the Young Lords began, fighting to give awareness to that, to what was going on, to get more people involved. And it was completely destroyed, and other neighborhoods followed. Today, Wicker Park, Westtown, Humboldt Park, Lakeview, all these communities went also by the wrecking ball. We actually created a movement to fight that. And I think that's what we're known for.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. A lot of people do forget how things like gentrification, redlining, other discriminatory practices and policies really systematically dismantled the imprint of culture the Puerto Rican community made on neighborhoods across Chicago.
So it's connected the whole question of self-determination for Puerto Rico, because what we saw in Lincoln Park was what we're seeing today, beginning to take even more shape in Puerto Rico as a displacement of the Puerto Rican nation.
To see an organization like the Young Lords kind of come out of this spirit of coalition building, this spirit of being a visionary revolutionary, to really just standing up to power, speaking truth to it, and demanding better for people, just demanding that equity, demanding that parity, and most of all, independence for Puerto Rico. But I don't want to get ahead of myself, because if I got to watch myself, because I'll go down the rabbit hole with you, Cha Cha. First, I want to also say, Jackie, thank you for coming, Profesora. For people listening, you're no stranger to this, but I'm an alum of DePaul. Jackie is one of my favorite professors there. So she actually helped coordinate all this. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Joshua. Thanks for having us. I can't think of a better moment in history to, revisit the history of the Young Lords. I'm super happy to be here. I always say, no matter how long I've been working on this, that every time that I get the opportunity to sit down with Cha Cha or any of the other members of the Young Lords, it's a history-making moment, right? It's a moment of profound historical value. And I consider this to be yet another one of those opportunities where I get to sit down and witness history in the making. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
Jackie, let's start with you. And Cha Cha was touching on this a bit earlier. but can you give us a sense of who the Young Lords were and why their existence is significant to Puerto Rican history?
Well, I mean, really, I think by most accounts, and I'm not the first to say this, but the Young Lords really were the entryway for Puerto Ricans in the civil rights movement in the U.S. And that's not to say that there wasn't activism around issues of Puerto Rico here in the U.S. before, but that in many ways they were the voice of the diaspora, right? They really allowed us to have a say, to have a place within the discourse of activism in the late 1960s and 1970s, and really represented the voice of the youth at that time. What's remarkable, though, is that here we are over 50 years later still talking about them. And there's a lot of reasons why, those of us who study the Young Lords, why we believe that it has been such a profoundly sustainable movement and why it had the impact that it had. But I think that the first walk away, the first sort of note to walk away with is that this is a movement that began at the local level, and even more at a very micro local level, right? At the level of the neighborhood, and even at times at the level of the block, a movement of young people addressing issues that were immediately relevant to them, immediately affecting their lives. And from there, these issues became profoundly tied to the larger questions of Puerto Ricanness and Puerto Rican identity. Puerto Ricans have always been a people of a lot of resistance too, right? That there's always been an answer from Puerto Ricans when it comes to being picked on. And the Young Lords were a very big answer to a time period, a context, and a system that was targeting Puerto Ricans in a very specific way, that was marginalizing the community and really abusing a community that was trying to establish itself here in the diaspora as a consequence of marginalization on the island and the colonization as it was taking place during that period of time on the island. So the Young Lords really was a response to that oppression.
Can you expound upon, what were some of the discriminatory practices and challenges that Puerto Ricans were facing in 1960s, 1970s Chicago?
Probably one of the biggest challenges that the Young Lords responded to directly and immediately was the efforts of the urban renewal policies that were being carried out by the Daley administration at the time, and sort of that effort to create the suburbs within the city. And especially Lincoln Park was one of those targeted communities, and definitely part of what was known as the master plan, the Chicago 21 plan of the administration, to again create these lakeside communities of wealthy or, up and coming people after a period of white flight from the cities, right? And that was happening really at the expense of communities that were trying to also establish themselves and establish a place within the city. And for all intents and purposes, Lincoln Park was already the home of a social fabric that had been knit by Puerto Ricans and the Puerto Rican diaspora in Chicago. That's what made it so impactful, right? That it wasn't just that you were moving a community of people or that you were moving people from their residences. You were moving an entire kind of social network, right? You were moving businesses. You were moving, systems of entertainment. You were moving, all of these different aspects of what really created one of the first and earliest sort of homes and communities for Puerto Ricans. That's really what made it a significant place, Lincoln Park.
And I think what was beautiful about that was that for the first time, Puerto Ricans and other poor people stood up and they fought back and they organized. People that had no skill in organizing. We just organized from the grassroots. And I think that's created a future for us to begin to fight, because it hasn't gone away. It hasn't dissipated. It remains the same. And so it created an avenue for us to to begin to fight back and stand up for our rights.
I think that there's obviously there was another major issue that the Young Lords responded to that sometimes gets marginalized within the history too. And that was, of course, the issue of police brutality, right? That was something that, was definitely was an impetus for the actions, especially the early actions of the Young Lords, was that a lot of the same things that we're sort of revisiting now and have never quite gone away, but the issues that kind of keep surfacing when it comes to communities and their negotiations and relations with state agencies like the police, that was an issue then too. That was something that they were trying to address too. Obviously, it went far beyond that. We're talking about an organization that became in every way a voice for transnational issues or for the relevance of these local issues at a global scale. And that's what made the movement so profound, right? Is that they were able to tie the local to the national, to the transnational. But those are, I think, in many ways, that was the beginning.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, Cha Cha, then. I would love to hear more. Like, take us in the time machine to that time when the Young Lords were founded. I know you mentioned, it was a community effort. It didn't all just rest on the shoulders of one individual person. Right. But talk a little bit about the founding. How did that come to be?
So I saw from my family, when they came in, they were like pioneers. So I saw them coming in through the churches. After Mass, they would organize the baseball teams, all the games. They would organize picnics. They take the family on special picnics out of the city and that. But what I saw was a community building. The Puerto Rican Parade being founded. I saw a community being built. And then I saw a community being destroyed when the people that once lived there before didn't want us to take their land. It was our turn, but they didn't want us to have our turn. They wanted to take it all for them. And I think that's when we finally saw where we had to fight.
I'm just thinking of the date that the Young Lords was founded. I have this date right? September 23rd, 1968.
Yes.
Right. So that would have been, for context on the timeline, if can keep me honest here, was it not 2 years prior there was the Division Street riots? Wouldn't that have been 1960?
Right. Division Street riots were before that.
Looking at the other part of that date, September 23rd, is that a connection to El Grito de Lares? Is that? Okay. It's also my wedding anniversary.
It was a selected date. It was a selected, and it was an unofficial date, so we selected that date because there was the uprising in Puerto Rico for the independence of Puerto Rico. So that became the birth date of the Young Lords and of our movement.
So were there any moments as you're in this movement, as you're leading, were there any moments that you feel helped prepare you? You mentioned like seeing your family at church and, kind of picking up different organizing skills from that and that example. But were there any other moments in your life that you felt really helped you prepare to lead the Young Lords?
Well, I mean, I was in the group. I grew through the group from the bottom up. I didn't come in in the leadership role. I never knew anything about management or anything like that. I was in and out of jail most of the time. But because I remained with the group that long, I guess, that gave me some kind of authority and relevance to the group. And I got just chosen as the head of the group. And then I kept going in and out of jail, more police repression. And that kept me in the news. And that actually the police made me the leader of the group, basically. I mean, that's the way we said it at that time. That helped as well to keep me in place there. But it helped us as well as a group. That we fighting back the police. We were fighting City Hall. I mean, we were just a group of youth on the corner, gangbangers fighting City Hall, fighting the police. And not by choice. It was their choice And the community saw that. But the community saw us also as fighters for them, and which was in a different way that they used to see us. So now we're standing up for the Puerto Rican communities that they can truly see them being evicted. They can truly see the prejudice that existed at that time of us as a community being hated by the white community and being kicked out, they wanted us out just for being Puerto Ricans.
On that same vein of thought, can you share a little bit about that shift, how the conversations went from the Young Lords being identified as a street gang to all of a sudden becoming this civil and human rights oriented organization? And what was that conversation like? And how does that conversation even happen? Is it?
Let's put it that way. There was several conversations because let me give you an example. So I come home to my house and I think somebody's beating up on my sister. So I join in. Later on, I found out it wasn't my sister. I was halfway drunk. But I found that out later, of course, after we went to jail, after they put in jail. But at that moment, I thought it was happening. So I joined in. Then my mother joined in to try to get me away from that. And then the neighborhood joined in. And then, there was conflict in the neighborhood between the Latinos and other community people that were living before us there. So that's how we got into Lincoln Park. And then we were there for years. So then we began to fight each other after that, after we were there for years instead of growing. But we couldn't grow because we were being evicted at the same time. See, we didn't get a chance to grow as a community where we could have fought each other and corrected each other's wrongs. We were being split apart because we were by the lake and near downtown. So we were in prime real estate and they wanted that land. And so we happened to be in the midst of it. And that whole process created conflict within our youth. And our youth began to fight in gangs and all the other things that go with that. And it was a period of time in this country where people were awakening to different things, injustices that were taking place. And we were part of that.
So then to start building those connections and that unified front, I mean, were y'all knocking on people's doors, having community meetings?
It started out with people getting arrested, going to jail. Like myself, I was going to jail and then people knocking on doors to get bond money and that. The bond money, I didn't have $80,000. When I didn't have that when I worked, So it started like that of learning how to do that, of learning how to raise money, learning how to act in different ways than we used to act, of just hanging out on the corner. Now we're raising money for bond. Now we're organizing special events. We're doing publicity. We're working on a newspaper to let people know about what's going on. We're going on TV programs. So all this was taking place. We're learning a whole new way of life and we're putting our own agenda together for the first time. And I think that's what made us forceful.
Did stepping down from leadership ever cross your mind as you're facing all these challenges? Did you ever feel man, I feel like I'm way over my head. I gotta focus on other things. This is taking a lot from me.
I think that's what I wanted all along, but I quit. It wasn't my choice. I think from the very beginning, we didn't want the leadership role. We didn't want to be in the forefront of anything. For sure, me knowing that if you're in the forefront, they're going to keep arresting you. Right? Yeah. So I didn't want that. I don't think we had that choice, that luxury.
I really appreciate that context. Jackie, I'm going to throw it at you. So hearing from Cha Cha, what you know of the Young Lords' roots in Chicago, I personally feel the more I learn about the history of the Young Lords, the more I feel the story of the organization is told through a very New Yorican lens. Do you feel like Chicago gets enough attention or credit when it comes to retelling the Young Lords story and lifting up that memory? Or do you feel the story of the Young Lords kind of has, is kind of mainly sitting with New York City's Puerto Rican population?
20 years ago, when I came across the roots of this movement and really started to understand what the movement was about and in the context in which from which it emerged, I thought that there definitely needed to be more work done in terms of understanding the context and understanding the history that allowed for a movement like this to emerge. I think that things are getting better, though. I think that's my conclusion, is that things are definitely getting better, that people are recognizing and sort of starting out at least the narrative by talking about the Chicago roots. But I think that there is a lot of work to be done to understand that context. Obviously hearing from Cha Cha now and hearing him especially to spend so much time talking about the period of time before that moment that people refer to as the sort of political awakening, the period of time as a gang. That period of time is really critical to understanding why it is that we're still talking about the Young Lords. The sustainability of this movement is really rooted in many ways in that history prior to September 23rd, 1968. It has to do with the history of Las Hachas Viejas, that community of migrants that came, the communities that they established, the young people that responded also with their own organizing on the streets as clubs or gangs. The context of Chicago being a city of gangs, if you will, where things are done that way, where gangs themselves are politicized. One way or another, a city of gangs and gangsters that were all political, whether they were on the right side of politics or not. And so for all intents and purposes, in many ways, the only way to respond was to organize yourself in the same way, right? And in a very complex way. So I think that we're doing ourselves a disservice by not focusing on that period of time before, September 23rd, 1968, and understanding all of the nuances, the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's really critical. And that is tied to Chicago history. And of course, even beyond that, even after that, right? After that short period of time that people, tend to really gravitate to when they talk about the history of the Young Lords. That's not all of it. That's not the whole story. There's lots that was done after and has been done since then that allows us to still talk about the Young Lords as this, profoundly impactful movement that we still look to as a model of sort of radical activism and organizing.
I think, unfortunately, in the Puerto Rican community, the question of unity comes up a lot. And I think a lot of times we will argue with one another to the point where we're not really getting anything done. I don't want to get into a bunch of examples, but it's almost like the movie Highlander. It's like there can only be one Puerto Rican community or one Puerto Rican organization doing something.
That's the thing. History is like that. People want to digest it in very narrow or very small compartments and pieces. And the reality is that no, there is a lot of complexity in history. I think when it comes, there's also just this race to the truth, which I think is very unfortunate because the truth, I always say the truth is somewhere in the middle. You're going to hear history is something that you get to by collecting as much information as possible. And somewhere in the middle of all that, those intersections, that's where you're going to find some kind of truth. And it's a truth. It's not the truth. And so, I am not in the business of eliminating any possibility when it comes to history. I think that the history of the New York Young Lords is really important, right? Because, they had an access to the media that was important to the preserving the history of the larger organization. Had that not happened, I don't know, maybe we wouldn't be talking about the Young Lords as much, right? That's possible. Sure. But sir, I'll tell you this much, in Chicago, there's always been a conversation about the Young Lords. There's always been an understanding of the role that they've played if you take the time to speak to individuals and to talk to people who may not have been, as prepared to talk about this at a, at a academic or at a, sort of, at the level of the media. But you talk to people, you talk to organizers, you talk to community folks, and they can tell you about how it is that the Young Lords became the movement that they became.
On that same topic, we were talking a little bit before the episode aired about the 10-point program, 10-point plan that the Young Lords put together. When I Google this, I also see 13-point program. What am I missing?
Well, you're missing.
I'll let Cha Cha answer this one. Yeah.
You're missing a group of good people, good-hearted people. They wanted to create a branch. They wanted to branch away from Chicago. And that's fine. Everyone, in any movement splits apart. There's nothing wrong with that. But we don't want to miss, what you're also missing is that this group never split their ideas. The ideas were the same. And so that's what we need to focus on. And so when we look at 10 points versus 13 points, that's irrelevant. Let's look at self-determination for Puerto Rico. And let's look at uplifting the Puerto Rican community and uplifting poor people and poor people's rights. That's the mission of the Young Lords. That has always been the mission of the Young Lords.
And that's the
that's the base for these points. Yeah. So that's what we need to focus on, is the mission and not the points.
I feel like, ever since I've been listening to, the members, certainly the original members of the organization, they've talked about platforms. At some point, we talked about 3-point platforms, but that has never been the focus of the action, right? The action was based on a mission, right? And the mission really was, the self-determination of Puerto Rico, the circumstances affecting people at a local level in Chicago, and all of those points, all of those actions were very recognizably related to much larger questions of oppression of poor people all around the world. And this is why when you look at their work, when you look at the Young Lords newspapers, when you look at the propaganda, when you hear the stories of people who were involved at the time, you're going to hear very natural connections between the issues that we were dealing with here in Chicago at the time and the larger issues that were at play. And I think something that we also have to kind of keep in mind is, and what has made this movement so impactful from the very beginning was that people really weren't paying attention to Puerto Ricans at the time in Chicago. Even politicians themselves, they were so wrapped up in sort of the anti-Black sentiments and actions and, the efforts to keep the city so profoundly segregated that they really weren't paying attention to what was happening amongst Puerto Ricans. And remember that we're talking about a people who were coming from a context, right? We're coming from an island where there was deep political repression. So to be able to come here, and not that this was a safer place to talk politics, but certainly it was a place where we could at least fly our flag freely. And so in many ways, like the power of the Young Lords to be able to take on the agenda of Puerto Rican self-determination can't be overemphasized. Yeah. It really can't be, because that was actually just such an important part of the impetus and the will to organize, right? It was actually the ability to try to do so under new circumstances, not better circumstances. Because remember, of course, we had the FBI, we had COINTELPRO, right, actively functioning both here and on the island, right? So we're still talking about a realization from the perspective of the state, from the position of the state, that they had to repress both people on both sides of El Chalco, right? And got to it very quickly. But they had to adjust, right? They had to adjust to a new circumstance. And certainly, we talked about the Division Street uprisings and how critical that was, because again, no one was paying attention to this community that was feeling the effects, right, of the oppression and of the suppression of their communities, and the marginalization of their communities. But they also sort of slept on the reality that Puerto Ricans have always been prepared to resist from the very beginning. There's always been repression, but there's also always been resistance.
Looking at the 60s and 70s, you have the Black Panther chapter here. You have people like Fred Hampton making moves, Rainbow Coalition, Young Lords being a part of that movement. I mean, can you talk about what were those relationships like?
We were in contact with Oakland, California, and we were in contact with Denver, Colorado, with Jorge Gonzalez and his movement there of Chicanos and that. And we went to a youth convention there in 1968 for the first time. And so with the contact with Oakland and Corky, we kind of expanded and we needed, that's when we began the Young Lords by dressing up with our berets and uniform. And we went nationwide, you know, and in a week or two, we were nationwide.
So also, kind of going back to this question of the Black Panther Party, I know that a lot of people saw recently Judas and the Black Messiah. So the movie does show, or at least attempts to depict the efforts of Fred Hampton and the Illinois Black Panthers to organize street gangs in Chicago, and really try to form a type of solidarity movement with gangs for all the reasons that we've already talked about, right? That the nature of the gangs in Chicago was unique. And, you know, being the type of organizer that Fred Hampton was, he saw the potential. He saw that these were capacities that could be brought together and be a force, right? In solidarity. And it sort of fast forwards very quickly. You see maybe one scene where, you know, members of the Rainbow Coalition are present, and there's a person who plays Cha Cha who shows up sort of in the background. But what we don't see, of course, is the history that led, sort of the circumstances that led to this coalition actually finally coming together. And, you know, amongst those was, of course, actions that the Young Lords were already taking, right? Even while they were still sort of in this in-between phase of gang, political organization. Again, they existed as both, right? They were both a gang and a political organization. And they were doing things. They were, you know, they were protesting, they were marching. And it was during one of these actions that they've got the attention of the Illinois Black Panther Party, and Fred Hampton approaches you. Do I have that right?
Yeah, can you share more on that, Cha Cha?
I think we had, the Young Lords were in connection with the Panthers. I think that history is kind of not told correctly in the movie. Not You told it correctly the way it was, but in the movie it's told a little bit incorrectly because we were working with the gangs already because we were part of the gangs. And Fred Hampton met us after we had occupied the Chicago Avenue Police Station. But what I mean by that is we went to a police community workshop meeting, and we basically took over the meeting, you know, and this was on the second floor of the Chicago Avenue Police Station. And so the police couldn't move out. Nobody can move out until we said our piece. So that's what I meant by that. And then we left and nobody was arrested. And then the next day followed with other similar actions in other meetings. Mm-hmm. And so the Young Lords became a target of the police. Mm-hmm. We were already a target, but we became even a more direct target of the police because it was they who we were focusing on at the time.
And that got the attention of Fred Hampton.
And that got the attention of Fred Hampton.
What a beautiful example to show people from different races, ethnicities, backgrounds coming together. Exactly. It was more of more rooted, the relationships were more rooted in class as opposed to letting race divide. What a world we could live in if that's the mentality people had today, right? So, Jackie, did you want to add something to that?
No, I mean, just exactly what you're saying, that we also have to recognize that, you know, there is a long history of, you know, counterintelligence tactics, very much geared at these types of solidarity movements, sort of time and again. You think about the land grants movement in the Southwest, and you think about, obviously, you know, the Rainbow Coalition and so many other movements were targeted precisely around the time where these solidarity movements were formed. Like solidarity, strategic solidarity has always been an enormous threat to state structures. And I think that there has to be an awareness of that. Like you said, if we can just continue to recognize the power of working together, working through differences and with differences, we don't have to pretend like they don't exist. That wasn't consistent with the message of the Young Lords. The Young Lords were powerful because they recognized that we had to have an anti-racist agenda. We had to have a type of racial consciousness. We had to understand that, in many ways, precursors to the conversations that we're having now, but definitely way ahead of their time, right? That was a big part of the power behind its sustainability too. The Young Lords, were embedded in a context of other political organizations that were really important too, and working collaboratively with them. So when we talk about solidarity with the Young Lords, it's not just the Rainbow Coalition. It's other community organizations that were really critical to pushing forward the actions of the Young Lords, working together, reinforcing each other, and really trying to make a difference. I think a lot of times that's something that gets lost in local history too, is that we look at all of the different organizations that were emerging at the time, either as a result of the Division Street uprising or just things that were going on in the city, right? That as the community began to really organize. And yes, there were factions, right? But they were coexisting, they were collaborating, they were in conversations, and their histories are profoundly tied. And so studying the Young Lords is studying the history of organizations in general in Chicago during that time and beyond.
What I remember of that time, that same period, besides the movie, Fred Hampton was the main speaker out there at all time, at our rallies, and he brought us in there to speak. So he would bring in me and preachermen from the Patriots to speak, because he was trying to create that broad-based coalition. And he wanted to create different leaders within, people that could speak within each community. And not just him speaking in terms of the Black community. He went to the Black community and built speakers within his own community.
He was a great orator.
I could never be that close of an orator as Fred Hampton. I mean, as someone that got to see him, oh no, he's a great orator. I mean, he would stun you. I mean, when he spoke, you listened intently, and not necessarily clapping and jumping around. You listen. I agree with everything he said.
Can I say a little something about the movie?
Yeah, please. No,
only because I
can tell, Jackie, you're ready.
No,
Go ahead.
Well, only because I've worked with their production team to do a couple of sort of exercises around a curriculum, which I thought was fantastic, and I understand that what the objective of the movie was. I think that there's an opportunity though to talk about that profound moment, right? That definitely wasn't in the agenda of this film, and because of what we said, right? That collaboration, that moment of solidarity was what really, that really distinguishes Chicago within the history of radical movements. Like it was that collaboration, even if it was for a moment in time, was much more than that moment. It became an idea, right? It became a massive idea that has transcended the period of time during which it actually existed, right? That's why we talk about the Rainbow Coalition the way that we do, because it was a concept, it was a philosophy that we were able to kind of bring with us from that moment in time. And I would say in terms of the representation of Cha Cha, I thought, well, obviously it was very brief. I think there was about one line. And like you said, the person who spoke, actually, not to shame him in any way, did a great job with big shoes to fill. But I did notice that he sort of spoke with an accent, which I thought was unfortunate, right? Because it erases the history of this movement in that, or an important part of the history of this movement, in that this is a movement diaspora Puerto Ricans. These were kids that were raised in Chicago. And, if we had an accent, if we have an accent, it's an accent that is a product of us being here as maybe bilingual speakers, but definitely English being the language of comfort for most of us. And so that's not necessarily the accent that should be emerging, from a figure like this. It doesn't allow us to articulate the power of this movement, which was that it was a movement that was and continues to be so important, that cannot be lost in telling the history of the Young Lords, that it really was, it was the diaspora. It was in the diaspora.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, that's a perfect segue to what I was going to ask both of you. Is there anything that you feel, we haven't touched on?
The gang, there is no gang except the Young Lords in the United States that organize as a full gang. They completely change themselves as a full gang. That's important to note. There are individuals, many individuals of different gangs that have changed themselves. But there's no complete gang like the Young Lords. That was the first group. And usually gangs are not politicized in that way. Usually they're anti that. They're anti the socialist movements and all that. And we were like the first group to stand up with them. And that's why they looked up to us. Because otherwise they would have been against us too. But they looked up. I remember, I can see it in their faces when we first were talking about politics, in front of them. I can see it in people's faces. The left. This is the left. Where they responded, in amazement that we were talking about them, for them. And I was happy because I believed in them. So I can see it in their faces that they were happy. They were proud.
Jackie, what about you? Is there anything?
Well, you're going to give me a chance to actually plug, the book project that you didn't mention, which was that.
Oh, I have that question ready for you.
My monograph is going to be preceded by a book that we've been working on together with the Young Lords, that I've been working on with the Young Lords, framed around the 50th anniversary event that we had at DePaul in 2019. Very much a conversation with all the different sort of players, right? All the different stakeholders that we've talked about today and beyond that. And I think that one of the things that will be revealed in both of these projects are precisely those moments that are so important that have sort of been left out of the popular narrative. We've talked about some of them. It's absolutely, like I said, critical to understand those years before before September 23rd, 1968. The evolution of the gang, the context within which the gang emerged, even what preceded them, the lives of their parents and the community that they helped set up, the story of Lincoln Park. But I also think that there's more that has to be told. Like I said, things that followed, right? The history that followed, those critical years that people tend to associate with the movement. Cha Cha's aldermanic campaign, the Lincoln Park camp, the years that the organization went underground, approaching DePaul University and building the archives, and all of the work that we've done since then to try to keep this legacy alive and this history alive for people. All of that contributes to us, again, still being able to talk about the Young Lords today, because it has been consistent. One thing that I never stopped hearing in the years that we've been working together is Cha Cha saying, I wasn't a young lord. It's not that I was a young lord. It's that I am a young lord, that we are the young lords. It's never stopped existing, right? And so, now when we have the new era young lords and young people really building off of that legacy, it's really important for them to understand that there has never been an ending from the perspective of the Chicago Young Lords. It was never dissolved. I think that, if you take it from the perspective of COINTELPRO, if you take it from the perspective of the sort of dominant narratives, there was an ending to this movement. But if you've been in Chicago and you followed the work that Cha Cha, that Omar Lopez, that Tony Baez, that David Rivera, that Sal del Rivero, and all these other people who were so critical from the very beginning to the movement, the stuff that they continue to do, then you know that the movement is still alive. The impact that they've had it never ceases. We've never ceased to be able to benefit from that in the city of Chicago. And then finally, I'll say that another sort of understated part of the history of the Young Lords in Chicago, unfortunately, has really been the role of women in the movement. Again, because it hasn't sort of been anchored to the feminist discourse and discourses that we've been able to, benefit from hearing, the New York narrative through that lens in many ways, and really sort of centering that positionality. We've sort of lost sight of how it was that, working class women, women sort of with boots on the ground were able to actually sustain this movement as the majority many times, right? The leadership of people like Angie Adorno, right? So that those roles have been really sort of neglected in telling the story, and certainly not from the Young Lords themselves. They tell it. I think it's just
they
about
they had their own group.
right.
It doesn't sound like a political name. It was called the Young Lordettes, but there was always a group of women that had their own group all the time.
And you had organizations like Mothers and Others.
Yeah, Mothers and Others.
So, Professora, you beat me to my other two questions that I was going to ask you, but it was nice. It was a good tease because you mentioned the archives at DePaul. I know we mentioned at the top as well. I want you to share a bit more on what that is, the work that you've put into that. And I'd also like you to talk about what should we expect on your book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, first of all, Cha Cha mentioned this at the beginning. It was 2001 when I came to DePaul, and I walked into this history. I was a fortunate, witness to work that was already being done. I think it was in the early 90s that members of the Young Lords approached DePaul University shortly after coming out of being underground as an organization in Michigan, that the Young Lords, Cha Cha, Carlos Flores, who's a photographer for the movement, David Hernandez, who's a poet and, affiliated with the organization, to Omar Lopez. Sal was there too. They approached DePaul back in the early 90s, Tony Baez, to write a book, right, about the Young Lords. That's what they wanted. And at that point in time, they were directed to the Center for Latino Research, and the folks there who sort of redirected the efforts to actually collecting the history of the organization, carrying out oral history. And that's what we did, right? We collected the histories. We carried out oral history projects. When I came on board, I came in as someone who had a bit of a hobby, if you will, because I can't call it anything beyond that. It's a passion, but I was also really involved in theater at the time. And so as we were collecting the histories, I decided that I was encouraged to actually write a play about the Young Lords, which I did at that time, and it was produced. And it helped us to actually put the archives to use. And I guess that's what I wanted to highlight, is that this is the archival project has been a living project. We understood that we needed to collect and work with it at the same time. And so, we've written articles. We did plays. We've interacted with them. And we really did see all of these as an opportunity to continue to build the archives. And that's what's remarkable. The Young Lords actually archive their own stories. I think that's what's fortunate, is that we don't have to rely on hearsay. They had the foresight at that time to start collecting stories, especially Cha Cha. There are so many monographs, and Grand Valley as well.
Grand Valley is a different thing in Michigan. They have because I was up over there, so we did about 80 interviews.
Yeah,
we traveled back and forth. Yeah,
that's an effort that Cha Cha took on.
So this type of work is being done in places where the Young Lords had a significant impact.
And they've done it from the beginning, right?
Yeah.
It was about Chicago, but in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Because New York had done some of their own stuff, but it was just a few people.
Now, the one in Chicago, is this the biggest one? This is the biggest archive, Jackie, I'm assuming? Or,
only because, yes, the oral histories
but-
that were collected at Grand Valley State
Yeah.
University are remarkable, and they're really comprehensive. Like you, Cha Cha really did take the time to think about all the different intersections. Like, honestly, you can't do this work without visiting them. I think that the size of the collection at DePaul is significant because it contains more than just, the oral histories. It has significant amount of artifacts, and it's still growing. We had Angie had donated her papers to the Young Lords Archives fairly recent. Her family donated the papers to recently, and other people continue to bring things in. So it's a growing collection, and really our most visited archive at the Richardson Library at this point in time. And also very much the source of, student investigations and research. We get scholars from all over the country really to studying the history through those archives. We have, professors taking students on tours of campus. And really that the archives have really provided really the sustenance and for the arguments, right? For us to be able to continue to fight, to collect the history and to mark the history of the Young Lords in Lincoln Park, because along with the community itself, there was also an attempt to really erase the history. And so what we're doing here is reparative work. We're doing reparative history work. It's like it's boots on the ground here too, doing this type of work to be able to make sure that it doesn't get erased either from the Lincoln Park history or even from our own campus history, right? That's important. We left our mark there, right, as a community, and that's important. I think it's attractive and important for students coming in to know that they have this treasure there that they can take advantage of and find themselves in.
Yeah. I do think it's a real disservice to the Young Lords' memory that there is no type of plaque or statue or any type of memorialization.
Well, funny that you should mention
that
because we're working on that. We're really proud. We're really proud of, I think, our recent efforts. It's actually part of our agenda right now as a team to propose a historical marker to be put in the building that was occupied. At that point, it was actually the administration building of the McCormick Theological Seminary. Now it's actually the School of Music at DePaul. But that building is the site of many community tours. People stop there and rely heavily just on retelling the history. But to your point, I think, our history needs memorialization too. We need our statues. We need our places to go to. We need our markers. This belongs to American history too. This is U.S. history. And so it's important that we recognize that we've lost so many of the places and so many of the historical places, whether it's the People's Church, all of that is gone. Those buildings were demolished. This is kind of our last building is what used to be the stone building of the McCormick Seminary. And so, we're working on that. We have a new president, and he's really sympathetic and is seems very supportive of the idea. And so we're hoping to see that come to fruition very soon.
People want to learn more about the Young Lords. Where can they do that? So the archives is one thing that can be accessed. People walking to the John T. Richardson Library on DePaul's Lincoln Park campus.
Definitely. You could visit the archives. There's a number of things that have actually been digitized. So I just recommend that people go on there. I feel like you always have to start with primary resources. This is why this upcoming book is so important, and I hope will be an important resource for people to begin their research on the Chicago Young Lords specifically, because it will be a collection of primary materials and primary voices speaking for themselves first, right? As well as the Grand Valley State University archives. I really think that has to be a starting point. And then, of course, there have been many wonderful things written. Yeah, we didn't mention them, but Pat Devine and some of the other organizations that were here in Lincoln Park at the time, faith-based organizations that were really, they had their own fight against urban renewal and were really obviously very, very influential. So yes, the primary sources.
Very extensive. You did your work. You did the work. As someone that is doing an audio project, I know there's a lot of work that goes into that. So very grateful for the work y'all put into that. Hola, Joshua Smyser-DeLeon here, founder and host of the Paseo podcast. Thanks for listening to the show, where we highlight stories by, from, and about the Puerto Rican community, from La Isla to the diaspora. If you want to help us share the diverse and vibrant stories that make up the Puerto Rican communities here on Paseo Boricua in Chicago and around the world, subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you stream your podcasts. Subscribing helps more people find the show and will help you make sure you never miss an episode. Leaving a 5-star rating and showing some love in the comments helps too. You can also give a donation by looking up the Paseo podcast on savechicagomedia.org. Okay, that's enough from me. Enjoy the show. So we have the archives. Your book's coming out. Do you have a date yet?
No date.
Okay.
Not committing yet, but
okay.
You'll know about it for sure.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure to share that out. We'll also put a link to the archives in the show notes too if people want to learn more.
Absolutely.
Any other, well, we're on the topic of books though. Is there a Young Lords book that you like out there that you think would be a good
I like every
entry
single
point?
one of them.
Okay.
I like every single one of them. So there have been a number of books that have dedicated at least some time to looking at the history of the Chicago Young Lords specifically. They've been, primarily focused on New York. You have Darrell Wenzer Serrano's book on the New York Young Lords. Johanna Fernandez has a chapter dedicated to sort of some of the early history of in Chicago as well. But I think pretty much our project is going to be the first comprehensive study of exclusively the Chicago movement. But those are all great, and you can go back, even further. The sort of iconic book Palante is one that we're going to be in conversation with in our book. And, all of those are important resources because I think that they all tell us something about the history of this movement.
It was then when we began that everything was fractured. And our goal was easy, united. And that's what we set out to do, to unite the people, to unite Puerto Ricans, to unite the community, to unite the Young Lords, to unite everybody. And that should be the same goal today. It always keeps going. It's a process of development. It never stops. It's a continuous process. And our goal is to keep the movement together. By keeping it together, we keep it alive. That's what we're trying to do. So that's why we'd say there's only one Young Lord. That's it. You're either a Young Lord or you're not. You're not a Young Lord from New York or a Young Lord from Chicago. You're either you're a Young Lord or you're not. Because that's the idea, is to keep the group united. The idea is to unite the movement, not to divide it.
United we stand, divided we fall, man. Jackie, what about you? Where do you feel the spirit of the Young Lords is today? We have all types of movements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I would also hesitate to use the word spirit because this was such an action-based movement, right? And so it's really, where do we see the actions of the Young Lords still manifesting, right? And I would say pretty much in many different places, right? In a lot of different directions, because if we're still talking about, gentrification, right? If we're still talking about gentrification, if we're still talking about urban renewal being solely based on the removal of communities and the elimination of people from their homes and the displacement of people from their homes, we're talking about the legacy of the Young Lords. We're talking about the tactics and the actions that really brought this movement together. If we're talking about police brutality, we're talking about the issues that the Young Lords were trying to bring to light and trying to challenge in their day. Obviously now we have, I want to, obviously shout out the New Era Young Lords, an organization that, has emerged in the last couple of years, with their chairman, Subidoro from Connecticut. And then we have, chairman here in the chapter here in Chicago, Paul Morales, who's actually a student at the Paul. And he, it's interesting. I'll give him credit for pointing out exactly, what Cha Cha just spoke to as well, which is this idea of unity and how important this was to the movement. And also how this was something that this organization was able to maintain and commit to despite differences. And I think that that's what's key to understanding how you can work on unity and you can work on solidarity through differences. Because, they did manage to keep this movement together for, now over 5 decades, through challenges, through differences. And again, I argue that has absolutely everything to do with the fact that they grew up together. They were in the same neighborhood. They understood what the challenges were, and they were committed to working through those differences. Because the issues were so big, because they were, universal and they were affecting their families. So more than the spirit, I would say the actions continue. And there are many wonderful organizations committed to these things. And I think that the walkaway, the message and the lesson absolutely has to be, though, is to remember, who the enemy is. Right? Not to forget and not to lose sight of what the action is, what it is that we're aiming to do and who it is that we're hoping to challenge, and, what those systems are that we should be actively challenging and in that solidarity, right? In a way that doesn't allow us to sort of fall so quickly and so deeply into the things that divide us. And so, let's move past the rhetoric. Let's move past the spirit and ideology, and if you will, and remember that this was an action-based movement.
Well, I'm really appreciative of the time you both have given us to have what I think is probably a topic that we don't discuss enough around the table. As Puerto Ricans. So I really appreciate the time. I do want to ask one lighter question, but it is also a controversial question and can create schisms in the Puerto Rican community. I feel like I'm hyping up this question way too much. This is a question that a lot of our guests like to get asked. Puerto Rican food in Chicago. What a twist, right? What a turn. Puerto Rican food in Chicago, favorite spot.
Oh my gosh, we're plugging somebody.
You don't have to plug anybody. It could be a place that's not open now if you don't want, but this can be very controversial. You might make some enemies. So let's see. Then Cha Cha, I'll go easy on you then. Here. Did you have a favorite place to go to for Puerto Rican food back in the day when you were in the streets of Chicago? It doesn't have to be open. It doesn't have to be open.
Well, that guy Mario had a restaurant. I don't know where his restaurant is.
Okay.
Mariano, because his father was the owner of the first grocery store.
Right.
Mario Rivera.
Uh-huh.
So Mariano, I think it's called Mariano. I think that's Puerto Rican. I think that's his son's restaurant.
Jackie, what about you?
Oh man, I'm gonna get in trouble because I have some real clear answers.
Yeah,
right.
I think that's why I asked.
I'm just gonna say Nelly's for breakfast without a doubt, and Bruquena for dinner.
Yeah.
All day, every day. I'll say it.
Unapologetic. I love it. Okay. Well, again, thank you for the time. If people want to keep up with you, Jackie, how can people keep up with your work? How can they get in contact with you? Cha Cha, same thing for you. If somebody wanted to reach out, how would they be able to do that? Jackie, let's start with
of course, always at DePaul. That's the easiest place for people to find me, Lazú at depaul.edu. I am no longer a member of the Twitter community, but you can find me on Instagram at Jax Lazú, Jax Lazú, and on Facebook too, Jacqueline Lazú.
I think it's through DePaul and Grand Valley.
Yeah.
And we work together. We're actively working together, getting these projects done. So through me, for sure. Yeah.
José Cha Cha Jiménez and Dr. Jacqueline Lazú, thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks so much,
really
Josh. This was great. Thanks so much.